on trade and those kinds of things.
Trump raises global tariffs from 10 to 15%. Businesses and governments now face $133 billion in repayments. Legal challenges flooding in as Trump defends his move. Trade deals with countries like Taiwan and the UK get disrupted. Let's understand how this impacts global markets and diplomacy.
Hello and welcome, I'm Ellie Richardson and you're watching another episode of Explained with me. The global tariff fight is back and this time it's sharper. Less than 24 hours after the US Supreme Court struck down his earlier tariff program, President Donald Trump raised the global tariff rate from 10% to 15%. This applies to imports from all countries. The new rate takes effect immediately, and it is the maximum allowed under the law he is now using. The move follows a major legal setback. On Friday, the Supreme Court ruled that Trump had exceeded his authority under the law he previously relied on, which is the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. The court said that the law did not grant him the sweeping tariff powers he claimed. The ruling was written by Chief Justice John Roberts. It was backed by both conservative and liberal justices. Trump responded strongly, he criticised the major decision, and he made it clear that the trade battle would continue. But instead of backing down, he pivoted, and that pivot is where the real story begins. The 15% tariff is grounded in a different statute, which is Section 122 of US trade law. This provision allows the US president to impose tariffs of up to 15% for a limited period. But there is a condition. The measure can last no longer than 150 days unless Congress approves an extension. No president has ever invoked Section 122 before. It exists in law, but it has never been tested at this scale. And that means new legal questions could follow. Unlike other trade statutes, Section 122 does not require a lengthy investigation before action is taken. That allows the administration to move quickly. The White House says the new tariffs include exemptions. Reports say that critical minerals are excluded, certain metals are excluded, energy products are also exempt. Still, the message is clear. The tariff strategy remains central to the Trump presidency, but the legal foundation is now different, and that shift is what global partners are now assessing. Some foreign leaders have welcomed the Supreme Court's decision. In France, President Emmanuel Macron signalled that the ruling reinforced the importance of institutional checks and balances. In Germany, Chancellor Friedrich Merz suggested that the decision could ease pressure on German companies and reduce strain on exporters. In fact, let's listen into some of their recent comments.
D'abord, je pense que ça invite tout le monde à réfléchir. Ça semble pas mal d'avoir des cours suprêmes et donc un état de droit. Tous ceux qui pensent que les cours suprêmes c'est des problèmes dans la vie politique, voilà, une cour suprême, elle a regardé la Constitution, elle dit c'est pas conforme à la Constitution. Là, tout le monde dit c'est formidable, ben voilà, c'est bien d'avoir des pouvoirs et des contre-pouvoirs dans des démocraties. Il ne faut pas aller trop vite non plus parce que je constate que le président Trump, quelques heures, a dit qu'il avait repris des textes pour avoir de nouveaux tarifs, mais alors ceci plus limités et pour tout le monde. Donc on va regarder exactement les conséquences, ce qui peut être fait. Et on va s'adapter. Au fond, nous, qu'est-ce qu'on
Ich werde genau deshalb in der nächsten Woche mit einer großen Wirtschaftsdelegation nach China reisen. Übrigens darf ich mal in Klammern hinzufügen, da werde ich wieder lesen in den Zeitungen, der Außenkanzler. Ich empfinde das mittlerweile als ein Kompliment. Denn ich möchte die Bundesrepublik Deutschland nach außen vertreten. Und ich habe bei den meisten Reisen große Wirtschaftsdelegationen dabei, die genau das verstanden haben. dass Außenpolitik heute auch Außenwirtschaftspolitik ist und dass Außenwirtschaftspolitik ein wesentlicher Teil unserer Wirtschaftspolitik ist. China.
But beyond the diplomatic responses, the ruling has extended a period of deep uncertainty. For more than a year, companies and governments have struggled to navigate an aggressive and shifting tariff strategy. The brinksmanship has strained alliances, it has rattled global markets, and it has tested economic resilience. Yet, even after the court's setback, the US president has doubled down. He argues tariffs raise revenue. Trump says they encourage domestic manufacturing and that he sees them as tools to advance geopolitical objectives. Tariffs, in other words, are not tactical. They are strategic and they have also been leveraged. Over the past year, the threat of steep duties pushed multiple countries into trade negotiations. The administration insists these agreements remain valid. Countries like Malaysia, Cambodia and Indonesia remain locked into negotiated rates of 19%. Indonesia, in fact, had just signed its agreement days before the ruling, accepting zero tariffs on American goods in exchange for a 19% rate on its exports. But the legal shift changes the leverage equation. Foreign governments may now reassess the concessions they made. Some leaders are already facing domestic backlash. Meanwhile, countries without negotiated deals could see temporary relief. Brazil had faced a 40% tariff rate. Under the new universal cap, that burden could fall, experts say, at least for now. So while the global rate has risen, some countries may paradoxically pay less. That creates a two-tier reality. Nations that negotiated early remain bound to higher agreed rates. Those that held out may benefit from the flat cap. There are also carve-outs. Certain agricultural goods, including beef, are exempt. Foreign autos and steel remain subject to separate national security tariffs. Goods covered under the North American Trade Pact remain tariff-free. And some Central American countries covered under a 2004 trade agreement are also exempt. Still, the tariff map has been redrawn again. Supply chains must re-collaborate. Governments must reconsider strategy, and domestically the political clock is ticking. Midterm elections are approaching in November and economic approval ratings are under pressure. A recent poll shows just 34% approve of Trump's handling of the economy, 57% disapprove. Affordability remains a major voter concern. Democrats argue that tariffs are adding to cost of living pressures. They need to flip just 3 Republican-held seats in the House of Representatives to take control. So, this is not just a trade policy issue, it is an election year issue. It is a legal test. And it is a global diplomatic calculation. But the central question now shifts back to Washington. To get this better, we need to understand what is the Section 122 that the President has now invoked. It is a provision of the Trade Act of 1974, which is a legislation passed by Congress to govern US trade policy. As we mentioned earlier, the law allows the US President to impose temporary import surcharges of quotas when the United States faces what it defines as large and serious balance of payment problems, which essentially means when imports significantly outweigh exports. Under Section 122, tariffs can be raised up to 15%. However, the measure can last no longer than 150 days without congressional approval. That time limit is central. After 150 days, Congress must extend or replace the action, or it automatically expires. Unlike other trade statutes, Section 122 does not require a formal investigation before tariffs take effect, enabling swift executive action. Historically, the provision was enacted in 1974 during an era of fixed exchange rates and genuine balance of payment crisis. It was conceived as a short-term emergency instrument and not a standing protectionist tool. Crucially, no court has intercepted Section 122 in a modern context. There is no judicial precedent clarifying how broadly this authority may stretch. Supporters argue the text grants sufficient discretion. Critics contend the statute was never designed for sweeping global tariffs. That unresolved legal boundary now sits at the centre of the debate. Moreover, that legal ambiguity is already affecting diplomacy. One of the first visible responses has come from India, which has delayed sending a trade delegation to Washington. The visit had aimed to finalise an interim trade agreement. Officials now indicate that the evolving legal environment has complicated timing. No revised schedule has been announced. Under the proposed framework, the United States was expected to reduce punitive tariffs of 25% on selected Indian exports that were duties previously linked to India's purchases of Russian oil. Those rates were projected to fall to 18%. In return, India had committed to purchasing $500 billion worth of American goods over 5 years, spanning energy supplies, aircraft and components, precious metals and technology products. Now, policymakers in New Delhi are reassessing durability and enforceability. Domestic politics is also a factor. The opposition has urged caution, arguing that trade commitments should follow legal clarity. Prime Minister Narendra Modi faces pressure to recalibrate. India's Trade Ministry says it is studying the implications of both the court decision and the new tariff structure. Let's also listen to President Trump's recent remarks on India after he raised the global tariffs.
I think my relationship with India is fantastic, and we're doing trade with India. India pulled out of Russia. You know, India was getting its oil from Russia, right? And they pull way back at my request because we want to settle that horrible war where 25,000 people are dying every month. And my relationship with Prime Minister Modi is, I would say, great. I also stopped the war between India and Pakistan, as you know. There were 10 planes we shot down. That war was going and probably going nuclear. And just yesterday, the Prime Minister of Pakistan said President Trump saved 35 million lives by getting them to stop. That's and I did it largely with tariffs. I said, look, you're going to fight, that's fine, but you're not going to do business with the United States, and you're going to pay a 200% tariff, each country. And they called up and they said, we have made peace.
Speaking at a press conference in India, Brazil's president has also shared his thoughts on Trump's bold move on tariffs. Let's listen in.
E eu quero também dizer para o presidente Trump que nós não queremos uma nova Guerra Fria. Nós não queremos ter preferência por nenhum país. Sabe? Nós queremos ter relações iguais com todos os países. Nós queremos tratar todos em igualdade de condições e receber deles um tratamento também igualitário com os outros países. Se isso for possível, eu acho que tudo voltará à normalidade. E é isso que eu espero. Porque o Brasil tinha a disposição de dar um exemplo ao mundo de fortalecimento do multilateralismo, sobretudo depois que o Trump anunciou as taxações de forma unilateral. Nós temos que dar um exemplo de que a gente pode juntos ter mais força para poder vencer essa batalha. Então, eu acho que os países como Índia, Brasil, Austrália e outros países do sul global podem estar juntos.
As markets reopen on Monday, investors will respond to the shift from a 10% to a 15% tariff. On Friday, before the ceiling was raised, major Wall Street indices closed higher, with technology and consumer stocks gaining after fears of prolonged emergency tariffs had eased. Now, traders are balancing two forces. First is policy unpredictability, and the second is potential economic impact on corporate margins and trade flows. Some analysts believe markets may initially price in continuity, assuming the broader tariff burden may not mercifully worsen over time. That could limit sharp sell-offs. Even so, volatility is expected. Export-orientated sectors are likely to see the most immediate movement as investors reassess demand, forecasts and profitability. In India, equity markets had already been navigating global policy uncertainty and mixed economic signals. Export-linked industries, including information technology, pharmaceuticals, textiles and auto components, may experience knee-jerk swings in concerns about margin pressure intensifying. However, if investors interpret the 15% rate as temporary and within an anticipated range, broader indices may stabilise after initial reactions. So, in short, Monday's session could bring short-term volatility, sector-specific adjustments and a broader repricing of risk settlement. For now, the tariff escalation moves into a decisive phase, where courts may scrutinise whether the statutory threshold has truly been met and whether a sweeping global measure fits within a temporary emergency framework. All this happens while the US Congress simultaneously prepares to weigh its 150-day approval power, creating parallel legal and political tests that will ultimately decide whether this policy remains short-lived or reshapes the boundaries of executive trade authority. That's all we have time for this episode of Explained. Stay tuned as we bring you more in-depth insights and stories that matter.